Hello, my name is Sandra Fritz, and I'm the chairperson of the Shrewsbury School Committee. The coronavirus pandemic and the delay in the initial state budget from the Massachusetts legislature has complicated the fiscal year 2021 budget process. The school department's July 20th revised fiscal year 21 budget is $67,499,696. This budget number was reached after $1.9 million in program and personnel reductions. On July 22nd, due to the current budget circumstances affecting town finances, the school committee felt it was appropriate to vote to approve Mr. Mizakar's recommended school department budget appropriation of $67,080,000. This represents a $775,959 increase over fiscal year 2020, or 1.17%. In addition to the gap between the school department recommended budget and Mr. Mizakar's revised budget recommendation, there is currently a projected COVID-related revenue loss that will not be covered through the Federal CARES Act funding, which means the school department's current gap is approximately $2 million. At this time, the school department's fiscal year 21 budget recommendation does not include making specific reductions to the line item budget to match the bottom line. Instead, the FY21 budget includes an adjustment of $2,002,696 in potential future reductions to the school department line item budget. This balanced risk approach allows us to open schools this fall with the necessary staff needed to provide student educational services. The school committee recognizes this budget plan will need to be adjusted during the upcoming fiscal year, with the understanding that if cost mitigation efforts and increased revenues do not materialize, in-year budget reductions may be required to meet the town meeting approved bottom line budget. Mr. Collins and Dr. Sawyer will now provide the details of the school department's fiscal year 2021 budget.
Thank you, Ms. Fritz. We will cover a few different topics in our presentation. We'll give a brief update on the planning that's going on for the potential school reopening this coming fall. We'll estimate what our current budget gap is, or show how we got to that number that Ms. Fritz just spoke about. We'll talk about some ongoing labor negotiations for cost mitigation. Talk about the sequence of how the budget has evolved with different meaningful events and information. And we'll talk about this pathway of balanced risk that we believe is in our best interest at this time. We'll also talk about the downside of that balanced risk approach. Let me begin with a brief update on school reopening planning. In accordance with the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, their guidance that they've provided, we've been developing plans for 3 potential models of education. All remote learning, which is what we experienced after the school closure this past spring. A hybrid alternating schedule approach where some students would come in on certain days for in-person learning, others on different days, so we can reduce the population of students at one time and enable 6-foot social distancing, as well as we had to look at what it would look like to bring all of our students back at one time with 3-foot social distancing. At last week's school committee meeting, we did a preliminary presentation that needs to be submitted to the department. And the recommendation at this time is for the hybrid alternating approach in order to reduce the population in school at one time. And a final plan will be presented to the school committee for their approval. Currently that's scheduled for Wednesday, August 5th. This is a very complicated, multifaceted, and ever-changing situation that we are working through, and we appreciate the feedback we received from our families as well as our staff, and we're looking to make the best plan possible to best serve our students and in a safe way. There are 3 key messages I want to share regarding our reopening of school. First off, the health and well-being of our students and families and our staff is our first priority and always will be. Our focus for the coming year is to develop a safe school environment for our students and our staff that prioritizes the well-being of all and also enables high levels of learning for all. We are certainly planning based on the guidance from the State Department of Education. We're also closely monitoring the latest information from medical experts and the evolving data regarding the prevalence of COVID within Shrewsbury and within the area in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So with that, in terms of the school department budget, As Ms. Fritz mentioned, that the school committee did vote on July 22nd to recommend a school department appropriation of $67,080,000 to be brought forward to town meeting. This represents an increase of $777,959 over the fiscal year 2020, which represents a 1.17% increase. And again, as Ms. Fritz mentioned in her opening statement, this recommendation is made with the understanding the school district still needs to close a $2 million budget gap somehow over the course of the fiscal year through a combination of cost mitigation measures as well as additional revenue in order to maintain staff and educational programming. And we'll talk a little bit more about what this balanced risk approach that we're taking to deal with that. But at this point, I'll turn it over to Patrick Collins, our Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Operations, who will talk about how we estimated that current budget gap.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. So in terms of estimated the current budget gap, we've been, since the closure period, developing a whole series of multiple models to estimate the various cost impacts and revenue losses related to COVID-19, and also trying to integrate into those forecasts how we might be reopening schools and some of the different cost structures associated with that. So on this particular slide that you see now, this shows what I'd call a mid-range cost estimation model, and as was referenced earlier, that the school committee voted to make a series of budget reductions totaling approximately $1.9 million and reducing 29.6 FTE. And having done that, the school budget status as of July 22nd was just about $67.5 million, leaving about a $420,000 gap between their recommendation and the town manager's recommendation. In addition to that, below in this slide, you can see relative to a variety of projected revenue losses to include decreased reimbursement from the Special Education Circuit Breaker Program of approximately $465,000. And then we are expecting, due to COVID-19 and how we return to school, a whole series of special revenue or fee and tuition revenue reductions to include decreased busing fees, decreased student activity and athletic fees, and decreased tuition for full-day kindergarten and preschool. So all of those revenue losses are estimated right now, as of today, at approximately $1.58 million. So the two figures combined give us that estimated $2 million gap in terms of what we believe our cost and revenue structure is for the upcoming year. And the school committee voted, and town manager recommended a revised budget of $67,080,000. At this point, I would turn it back to Dr. Sawyer to talk a little bit about some of the cost mitigation measures ongoing.
Thank you. So we're still engaged in a dialogue with several of our labor unions that are part of the school department with the goal of seeking some compensation adjustments from the existing labor contracts that would help decrease our costs in this fiscal year, and that most importantly would preserve jobs in order to maintain educational programming, as well as avoiding further compromising learning and teaching conditions, working conditions for our staff. Without mitigation of costs to reduce that $2 million gap, we will likely need to make further significant reductions in staffing at some point. It's important to note that to get to this point in the budget, we have already cut 29.6 full-time equivalent positions, so about 30 positions that are not going to be in the program for this coming year. That was already part of our plan prior to COVID because of the structural budget deficit that we unfortunately continue to face as a town. But for illustrative purposes, to close the gap by $2 million will require the equivalent of cutting about 30 additional teachers or about 78 paraprofessional positions. Again, that's not our plan by any means, and our goal is to not reduce any more positions beyond what already had been cut. But that just gives a sense of the magnitude of a $2 million gap. We are hopeful that between cost mitigation with our employee organizations, as well as we're hopeful that the projections that the budget's based off of from our town manager, Mr. Mizikar, which are appropriately conservative related to the amount of state aid we might receive, some combination of some better numbers from the government, potentially some additional federal stimulus dollars that could help us, as well as these cost mitigation elements with our employee groups, all told will enable us to be able to move forward throughout this coming school year without any further reductions. I know that's very particularly important to the school committee, that we avoid any more job cuts if at all possible. And at this point, I'll turn it back to Mr. Collins to talk through a bit of the sequence of where we are in terms of meaningful events and information.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. So with respect to the sequence of events, I think it's important to illuminate, obviously, the differences in the COVID-19 environment from what is a typical annual budgeting process. And in past years, in a typical annual budgeting process leading up to an annual town meeting each May, we have lots of information with a high degree of certainty, including state aid figures. Of course, this is an atypical year. We're in late July right now, and we still do not have certainty around state aid information. So that's what makes this whole process a bit different. We do need to move forward in terms of getting our local municipal government services and school department operations up and running, and therefore we're leading into this August 8th town meeting to have some measure of local certainty about how we're going to operate. We know that the fiscal 21 state budget approval is delayed, and that maybe we'll be getting information on state aid sometime between the August and September time period, and hopefully a final state budget during that time period. And as has been discussed with other elected officials and the town manager, that this would make sense then in this atypical year to hold a special town meeting in the fall in order that we might react to having that more certain information, and then having also opened up our schools and having an understanding of our cost structure under the new conditions, and then making subsequent budget adjustments at that special town meeting based upon that more certain information. Also, what's looming in the background right now, of course, is the potentiality of some additional federal stimulus funding, and that could also certainly make our situation better. And hopefully between now and what might be a fall special town meeting, we would have some certainty around that as well. So that's why this sequence of events isn't quite lining up neatly for us this year, but it's important to move ahead with that understanding that we're working with some very uncertain information. And again, back to taking this pathway of balanced risk right now is in our best interest because timing is a key component of that in the uncertainty of information. We do need to work in somewhat of a risk environment financially to move ahead. As was mentioned earlier, despite the $1.95 million in reductions already, we are still looking at what is an estimated $2 million gap right now. But we do know that making significant reductions right now in the face of reopening schools during a pandemic would be counterproductive. And especially if some additional funding is a possibility or probability in the coming weeks or months. So taking this pathway of balanced risk avoids all of the problems associated with trying to solve all that $2 million gap by further staff reductions, and then just a few weeks later with the potential of just having to rehire all those staff. So that's why we're taking this approach of balanced risk with the hope of additional funding coming forward our way. On the next slide, we do, of course, want to and have talked about and evaluated the potential downside of this balanced risk approach, which is if no additional funding comes forward from what is projected, then we do need to reassess our cost structure. We need to see how we're reopening schools and what the costs are related to that. and that the potential of making some additional further reductions during the middle of the school year is a possibility. That's the downside of the balanced risk approach, but again, we think the former approach going forward is the better alternative at this particular point. So I'll turn it back to Dr. Sawyer at this point.
Thank you. So just to summarize, the school committee did vote again to recommend a budget to town meeting of $67,080,000. Represents a $777,959 increase over the past fiscal year, which is a little over 1%, 1.17%. It's critical to understand that this recommendation is made with the understanding that we still need to close this $2 million budget gap over the course of the fiscal year. We're hoping that cost mitigation measures combined with additional revenue will enable us to maintain our staff and our educational programming. I do want to thank Mr. Collins in particular for his extraordinary work on this budget situation, which has been unlike any other we've experienced in our careers. All of his support staff, Kim Fitzpatrick in particular in the office, our business office, as well as all of our support team at central office. I want to thank also all of our staff in the Shrewsbury Public Schools for the extraordinary work they did over the course of the closure last spring, the work that so many are doing this summer to try to plan for a school year, again, that will be unlike any other we've experienced. And I want to thank the school committee for their ongoing support throughout this really extraordinary time. And at this point, I'll turn it back over to Ms. Fritz, the school committee chair, for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. As you've heard, this year's budget has been extremely challenging, and it has required and it will require constant assessment of new information as it evolves. It has required skilled estimates based on known and many unknown factors. And on behalf of the entire school committee, I want to thank Mr. Collins, Dr. Sawyer, and the entire public schools leadership team for the significant amount of time and effort that they have devoted to this fiscal year 21 budget process. I also would like to publicly thank Mr. Mizikar and the Board of Selectmen, who have worked closely with the school department throughout the COVID crisis and the resulting difficult budget process. The school committee believes that the school department's fiscal year 21 budget approach is prudent and a thoughtful response to this year's very difficult and fluid process. I thank you for your time and attention, and I respectfully request your support of the school department's fiscal year 2021 budget request. Thank you.